So this really isn't your typical camping story, but it's got an element to it, so I don't think it's too far-fetched to call it one. It happened on my birthday some 20 years ago. I had just turned 9 years old and had a big party with all of my friends and relatives earlier in the afternoon. Come nighttime, I told Mom that I wanted to sleep outside. I used to do that sometimes. Dad would pitch a tent for me in the backyard whenever my cousins would sleep over. I loved going camping with my parents, so during school months when we couldn't go camping, I would satiate my appetite for the wild in our own backyard. That's essentially how I ended up in a tent pitched in the backyard in the company of my cousin Chloe. And yeah, the time was about 10 p.m. and me and Chloe were busy catching up since we hadn't seen each other for about a month. Then in the middle of our conversation, we heard something rub against the wall of the tent. We may have heard the same sound 3 or 4 times in the first 10 seconds after hearing it initially. But then only moments later, not only did the rubbing sound intensify, but the tent was now shaking from all the rubbing. Everything had happened so fast that we had very little time to react calmly and properly. We both panicked, jumped up, then I saw Chloe zipping down the mesh and the nylon door at the same time. As soon as the door was zipped down, a swarm of rats began to flood the interior of the tent. We both ran out, using the rats as mats, as there was absolutely no place to place our feet on solid ground. The best description for the scene would be the sea of rats. I mean, the entire backyard was covered with them. It was all dark gray everywhere. We saw everything unfolding because the floodlight with the sensor had already been triggered. Chloe and I first went to the back door, but it was locked. It was an example of forces of habit. My dad should have left the door open, but he locked it as he normally does. We then ran to the front yard, not to get to the front door since they would have been locked as well. I took Chloe there so we could take refuge on the roof of our car. On top of our car, we began screaming from the top of our lungs, but Mom and Dad were already running out of the house. They had already heard the initial commotion, so they went to check the backyard first. Then after realizing that we were no longer there, they doubled back to the front of the house where our screams were coming from. Mom and Dad took us inside the house while keeping us off the ground. We had a couple of dozen rats run inside the house as the door had to be opened to get inside. I remembered not feeling quite safe inside the house either, but I suppose it was definitely better than the outside. Come morning, Dad was busy trapping the rats and Mom was busy on the phone with animal control. We later learned that a small earthquake had occurred overnight. Whatever they say about rats having sixth sense that can warn them about natural disasters seemed to be true. Anyhow, both me and Chloe got bit multiple times by the rats. We both had to get tetanus shots in the afternoon. I don't know if it does anything after the fact, but Chloe is alive and well and die as well. It's just something crazy that had happened to me when I was young. I just thought I'd share it. Bye now. When I was a little kid, I had a sleepover at a friend's for the first time in my life. My friend's name was Gavin, and I had met him at school. We were really close for about a year, then we drifted apart, but that's besides the point. But yeah, my mom dropped me off at Gavin's at 4:30 p.m. on a Friday. We played some board games, watched a Disney movie, had some snacks, then we went to bed at 9:30. One thing that I should mention is how wealthy Gavin's family were. Their house was ginormous. It was a 3-story building, and I remember that it had a classical look to it, both inside and out. I mean, the house had a 6-car garage, so that should tell you plainly how wealthy these people were. That being said, the interior of the house was decorated with many classical items, including a crap ton of paintings. I was told not to touch them from the get-go, and I listened, but there was one painting that really grabbed my attention. which, if you think about it, it's kind of unexpected for a kid who's only 9 years old. I don't know about you, but I've never met a 9-year-old who told me he or she was mesmerized by a painting. But that's exactly how I felt about one particular painting. It was of a girl in a red dress. She looked about our age, and the painting portrayed her in a peaceful state. Anyway, I stood in front of the painting and stared at it for so long that Gavin's father took an interest in my fascination, and he began explaining to me about the origin of the painting. He told me that the girl in the painting was an actual person. The little girl was apparently born in Philadelphia back in the early 1800s, and she died from an illness at the age of 9, my age at the time. Not that it's important, but the painting was worth a couple $100,000 at the time, and I hear it's likely worth millions today. Well, that's what I have been told by a friend of mine who works at an art gallery. But back to the story at hand. Gavin fell asleep first, and I was having trouble doing the same, probably because it was my first ever sleepover. It felt weird not sleeping in my room. Also, for me at that age, that big old house was actually kind of scary. I would love to live in a house like that today, but I saw things differently then. My eyes were wide open when everyone else had fallen asleep. I knew everyone had gone to bed because I could no longer hear people walking up and down the stairs. It had been like that for hours already. At some point during the night, I heard the door creak open, then saw the impossible transpire right in front of my eyes. The girl in the red dress, it was she who opened the door, and now she was walking toward the bed onto the side where I was sleeping. I closed my eyes and hoped that she'd go away, but it didn't work. I felt her touch my left cheek with her finger. It felt cold and lifeless. Obviously, I've never been touched by a dead person, but I think that's exactly how it would feel if I actually were. I kept my eyes closed as the little girl continued to touch me in different places. First, it was my cheek, then my lips, chest, legs, and my feet eventually. The touch stopped after a while, but the little girl began whispering in my ear after that. I didn't know what she was trying to say. Her voice was too low, and her English didn't really make sense to me. I could make out a word here and another there, but that was about all I could understand. Not that it mattered, since there was no way that I was going to engage her in a conversation. I stayed awake the whole night and didn't even go to the bathroom, even though my balls were ready to explode at the gentlest of touch. Come morning, I called Mom and told her that I wanted to go home. I didn't even want to stay for breakfast. Needless to say, that was the first and the last sleepover in my life. My mom told me that the little girl was the product of my hyperactive imagination when I told about it to her as a child, but once I became an adult and told her that it was real, well, that time she called BS and told me to stop trying to scare her. It's fine by me if no one believes my story. As long as an experience like that never repeats in my life, I'm a happy camper and people can call BS on my story all they want. It's all good as long as the girl stays in that house. I used to work security at an old hospital building that was no longer in use. The building was supposed to be sold to a developer to be repurposed as some kind of a research center. But the deal went bust and the owner was waiting for a new buyer. As you might imagine, it wasn't a pleasant experience working there. Just imagine the history of that place. How many people do you think might have died in there? It was in operation for something like 40 years. So if there's a place in America where you might find a ghost, it's a good bet that it's the hospital where I worked at. Anywho, it had been a month since I started working there. By then, I had already seen and heard some things that seemed unnatural. You may ask why I didn't just quit. Well, the answer is always obvious, no? Money was tight and the job paid fairly well. The pay increased even more after the first month. The graveyard shift security guard had quit, and the hospital was having trouble finding a replacement. It made it tough because of the schedule. There were plenty of applicants who were more than willing to work the day shift, but not so much after dark. I tell you, people are a lot more superstitious than you think. Having said that, I ended up taking the graveyard shift after the hospital offered a 20% pay increase under the condition that I made the switch of the shift. The way I saw it, it was scary during the day all the same, so it only made sense to take more money and be scared a little more overnight. The first night of the graveyard shift was a memorable one, sadly in a real bad way. I was inspecting the first level basement on that night as it's scheduled to be done once a week. As luck would have it, I was walking by the morgue, well, the old morgue, when I heard the sound of something knocking on a metallic surface. I begrudgingly entered the morgue and began inspecting the room with only a flashlight. I already knew the lights in that room were busted. A request for repairs had been made, but with the building rotting away without a new buyer, the owner wasn't in such a hurry to keep the building in tip-top shape. But back to the morgue. Inside the room, I was able to narrow down the area where the noise was coming from. The source were the fridges where the bodies used to be stored in. And strangely enough, all the doors of the fridges were open. That's strange because we left them open to keep them dry. They should have been open. As I walked closer to the fridge, I was able to pinpoint the exact fridge that was making the noise. I approached it, then reluctantly opened the door, and that's when out of nowhere, something grabbed me by the hair, then it pulled me inside the fridge. Half my body was dragged into the fridge, and I couldn't see anything because I had dropped the flashlight. My wrist had been fractured when I tried to hold on to the door to prevent my body from being dragged in further inside. I didn't stop fighting, however. Broken wrist or not, I was doing everything to crawl out of the fridge. After about half a minute of struggle, I popped out of the fridge like a cork on a wine bottle. I then speed bursted out of the morgue at the speed that would make the Flash proud. Once I got to the ground floor, I went straight to my car instead of the security office. I was not staying inside the building a second more than I had to. Anyhow, I called the manager that night and told him what had happened to me. I also went to the police and made a report about being attacked by an unknown perpetrator. I didn't say that I was attacked by a ghost or a creature, because you all know how that's going to turn out. But yeah, I was sent to the hospital after that, and subsequently found out that I had more injuries than just a fractured wrist. My face was covered with cuts and bruises. The doctor told me that the cuts looked to have been made by human fingernails. I needed 20 stitches to close up the gashes on my face, then an additional 20-something stitches for the cuts on my arms. I'm currently in a lawsuit against the owner of the building. He refuses to pay for the hospital bills, and not to mention for the time that I'm missing work. My lawyer tells me that the case is a slam dunk, but that it will take some time to get resolved. Until then, it's back to work for me, doing more security work, since no retail store wants to hire someone with huge scars on their face. Life is a struggle for me right now, but I'm hoping it gets better. I could really use some good news soon. I enjoy camping, but not in the company of others. I mean, the whole point of going out into nature is to be away from people. So yeah, I always go camping on my own. That being said, there was this one time when I got lost in the woods. I had already set up camp in the afternoon and began hiking in the woods at around 2 p.m. The thing is, I got carried away and ventured a little too far into unknown territory. Bottom line, I got lost and couldn't find my way back to the campsite. It was dark by 6 p.m. and I knew I was in a big trouble. There's no cell reception where I camp, and I never bothered to invest in a satellite phone. I was going to have to spend the night with only a thin jacket and a half a bottle of water. Anyhow, I continued walking a bit more because I thought I had seen some lights to the south of my current position. If I was lucky, I was going to find a fellow camper. 20 minutes later, I was greeted by a large group of campers who seemed to be having a party in the middle of the forest. Remember what I said about camping alone? Well, that opinion quickly went out the window as I was very happy to see people. I was welcomed to the party and I said hello to the 9 people who were set by a bonfire. I don't really remember much from that night, as I quickly got drunk out of my mind, then hooked up with a girl whose face I can't for the life of me recall. Once I arrived at their campsite, it felt as though something had taken over my mind and I was put on autopilot. I ate and drank everything they had offered. I laughed and danced with them like I had known them my whole life, as though they were my best friends. I'm generally very cautious with people. It takes a while for me to trust anyone. Hence, I was definitely acting out of character that night. It all seemed like a dream, and you know what? It might as well been, because when I woke up, there was nothing around me. All the tents were gone and not a soul other than me was there. The only sign of there ever being people from the previous night was the already expired bonfire. Mind you, I woke up at 7 AM. You can't possibly tell me that all 9 people who were drunk like fools had the awareness to wake up early and leave without me noticing. But hey, they were gone, so I suppose they left. Till this day, I wonder if everything that I experienced that night was some sort of a fear-induced imagination, that perhaps my brain found a way to keep me occupied as I feared for my life. I don't really know, but all I can tell you is that everything felt truly real.